Okay, everybody, welcome to this episode of the podcast. Thank you very much for joining us. It's Saturday, June 14th, technically. It's a little bit after midnight here in Israel. I'm joining from Rishon LeZion in central Israel, and as ever, I'm delighted to have the company of Yaakov Lappin, in-house analyst at the MirYam Institute, who's joining from Jaffa, having just concluded several of his media appearances over there. And we wanted to get this episode out because we wanted to provide you with an update in real time about Iran's retaliatory strikes against the state of Israel, a flurry of which have just concluded. Before we get into the substance of that, I want to remind all of you that if you're enjoying this content, I'd be very grateful if you could please subscribe to the show wherever it is that you download your podcast from, and also be sure to leave a rating and review at those same platforms of this show, because doing so really does help us to reach an ever wider audience. And as ever, I thank you in advance of your partnership in that endeavor. I also want to remind you that you can see much of the content that we release via the audio podcast at our YouTube channel at the MirYam Institute. That's MirYam Institute. Just type that in to your YouTube search bar and you'll find us. And of course, I hope you'll subscribe and like the show there. So, Yaakov, with all of that having been said, give us the lowdown as you see it on what's transpired this evening. Just before we get going, I want to confirm you've got this in speaker view on your end. Is that right?
Yes, it
Great. So
automatically begins on speaker view, and I confirm that as well manually.
wonderful. So off you go, Yaakov, and then I'll provide some responses and insights of my own as best I'm able.
So you want to begin with the latest developments tonight rather than going back in time to yesterday that we'll get to later, I
Wherever you
assume?
want, provide the context you think is appropriate. Let's get to it.
Okay, so I'm actually going to start, if you don't mind, at the beginning, and I'll just give a brief overview because the events of the past 24 hours, almost 24 hours now, are so dramatic, so historic, and so unprecedented that I think we should start there. And what we're talking about is an Israeli Air Force surprise preemptive mass strike on hundreds of targets in the Islamic Republic of Iran, with the primary aim of the mission being to knock out Iran's nuclear program, and as a series of complementary strikes, taking the fight to the military command structure of the Iranian regime. So, in addition to the Natanz uranium enrichment site, the Fordow uranium enrichment site, Isfahan, an Iranian nuclear site, and other sites that have been hit by the Israeli Air Force, we have seen the decapitation of the IRGC's military command. So the commander of the IRGC has been eliminated. The chief of staff of the Iranian armed forces has been eliminated. The commander of the IRGC's Air Force and a number of his deputies have been eliminated. There are reports that the commander of the Quds Force has been eliminated. Now, this is jaw dropping capability, and I'll explain why. It's one thing to send your jets to a territory that's on your border to eliminate adversaries that are 50, 100, even 200 kilometers away. It's a whole different ballgame to do that against an adversary that's 2,000 kilometers away, and these personnel moving targets, and they were in apartments, in underground bomb shelters. The ability of the Air Force to take out enemy personnel in Tehran in multi-story apartment buildings with precision strikes is an absolute breakthrough in capability, which, from my understanding, is actually quite recent. It's not something that the Israeli Air Force would necessarily have been able to do a few years ago. It was probably thinking about how to do that, but to act as if, in terms of the modus operandi, in the same way that the Air Force acts against Hamas in Gaza, against Hezbollah in Lebanon, and against the IRGC in Tehran in the same manner is absolutely incredible. So what we've seen are strikes on the nuclear program, and it seems to me that very serious damage has been caused to the nuclear sites. We have seen the command structure of the Iranian military, the IRGC, which is the elite military of Iran. The regular army doesn't enjoy most of the resources. The IRGC, which is basically in an alliance with the Ayatollahs, gets the lion's share of resources. And so when the air force of the IRGC is struck, that means that these are the people who are the masterminds of Iran's missile capabilities. It means that they are the masterminds of Iran's UAV capabilities. They are behind what came today, tonight to central Israel and other parts of Israel, which I'll talk about in just a moment. So we've seen wave after wave, reportedly something like 9 waves already of Israeli airstrikes throughout the country of Iran, a vast country. Just in the capital of Tehran, we have 15 million people. That's 5 million more than the whole of Israel. And so this is the largest enemy. Now, the symbolism here and the practical significance of what's happened here is cannot be overstated. Iran is the head of the tentacle being all of the proxies that Iran has built. And now that we've hit the head of the tentacles, there are no tentacles that are retaliating. All of the retaliation is coming from Iran itself because its proxy network has been destroyed. Hezbollah is in no position to fire at us. Hamas is in no position to fire at us. Tens of thousands of Shiite militias, Iranian backed in Syria, are gone. Iran is alone. So, what triggered the strike? I think also important to talk about that for a moment. There was a secret Iranian push to break out into nuclear weapons. This is something that the Israeli military intelligence directorate detected in time, and what the Iranians were doing was pretending to hold negotiations with the Trump administration while moving forward to assembling nuclear weapons. They had enough uranium for 15 atomic warheads. They had activated something called the Weapons Group, which is a secret group of scientists and engineers whose job it is to create warheads using that uranium. This was all in action, and it was all being watched by Israel. And the Iranians were sure that nobody knew what they were up to. Of course, they were dead wrong. And so we are in, a whole new era here in the Middle East. This conflict is going to shape the future of the region, and I also think the world, by the way, for many years to come. I think the Iranians have been shocked by what they absorbed. It took them more than 20 hours to get their act together before even Ayatollah Khomeini was able to address the nation. And tonight they fired a volley of around 100 ballistic missiles at Israel. It's worth pointing out that this volley is smaller than the past 2 times that the Iranians fired ballistic missiles at Israel in 2024. That doesn't mean that they're not going to fire again tomorrow and the day after. They're very likely pacing themselves. But the reason why this volley was relatively small, even though it's a very serious threat, is because in addition to all the targets that I described, the Israeli Air Force spent many hours going after ballistic missile launch sites, ballistic missile bases, and basically reducing Iran's ability to respond. And it's not just the Air Force that did this. According to multiple reports, Mossad commando teams that had been injected on the ground in Iran basically activated a whole series of weapons that really sound like they come out of some sort of James Bond movie. Benjamin, it's almost sci-fi what we're hearing, but they were in Iran and they had a base reportedly of quadcopters as a kind of drone with multiple rotors with explosives, and they fired that. They sent those drones at Iranian ballistic missile sites as well as air defense sites, according to reports, and they also managed to smuggle missiles, little missiles, into Iran, which they fired at Iranian missile sites, surface to air. So that actually helped the Air Force. There was less challenges to the Air Force. So just trying to imagine visually what I'm describing, it really sounds like something that's from a different world. This is what has happened in Iran over the past 20 hours or so. And in response to that, the Iranians fired, as I've said, 100 ballistic missiles. Most of them were intercepted by the Arrow 3 system, and a few got through into central Israel. By the way, we're just seeing now there's a UAV intrusion alert in Eilat in southern Israel. So they're also firing UAVs, which are being intercepted by helicopters. And essentially, we are in a open conflict with the Iranians. I think this is just the beginning. There's a lot more to come. There's also some kind of messaging going on between Israel and what's left of the Iranian leadership about how far this can go and what each side is willing to do. So there's a lot to unpack here, but I think, this is the very basics of what's going on, and it's worth pointing out that we have reports of a number of injuries in missile strikes in Tel Aviv, but most of the missiles were intercepted, and we don't have any reports as of now of anybody killed, but there were a number of people who were seriously injured.
Yeah, thank you very much for the overview, Yaakov. And for the listeners, I think that it's fair to say that if October the 7th was really what Israel's intelligence and military capabilities look like at their absolute lowest ebb, the strike against Iran's nuclear weapons program and key personnel involved in that effort to bring Iran nuclear weapons capabilities really represents Israel at its very finest and its very best. And if anybody was wondering where the Israel of old had gone to, the Israel of 1967, of the Six-Day War, the Israel that decimated, destroyed the Egyptian Air Force on the runway by way of a preemptive strike, as that regime threatened to bring about the complete annihilation and destruction of the states of Israel. Those people should wonder no more. That Israel, it turns out, never went anywhere, and it is showing its true colors here today. A little bit of background in addition to what you just mentioned, Yaakov, about how this came about. So, in November of 2024, listeners will recall that Benjamin Netanyahu presided over the elimination of, among others, Hassan Nasrallah, who was the chair of Hezbollah inside southern Lebanon. And based on the fact that the IDF had shown itself able to remove such an individual and had actually set about and succeeded in removing such an individual, the Prime Minister assessed that Iran was now, militarily speaking, somewhat naked, very, very exposed, and as a result of having a lack of other options, was very likely to move aggressively and speedily toward gaining the nuclear weapons capabilities that Prime Minister Netanyahu and others, but specifically and most sedulously, Prime Minister Netanyahu has said for decades, I would say, Iran must never take possession of. And so it was at that point in November of 2024 that the Prime Minister expressed that the defense establishment, the intelligence establishment here in Israel, was to set about eliminating Iran's nuclear weapons capabilities. Now, why the timing? The timing is not really so surprising. President Trump, when he was entreating the Iranians to come to some sort of arrangement and a deal with the United States of America that was founded on the idea of Iran not possessing nuclear weapons, but also not possessing the ability to enrich uranium to nuclear weapons grade, President Trump gave them a 60-day period to, for want of a more elegant phrase, to come to heel. That 60-day period actually came to an end on Thursday. And therefore, on Friday, after that full length of time had expired, was when Israel decided that it was appropriate to launch these strikes against Iran. And what I believe you're seeing, Yaakov, is you're seeing Israel really set the conditions for what I would describe now as a war against Iran. I wouldn't describe this as an operation. I wouldn't describe this as an aerial bombardment campaign in isolation. I think that this is part of what is now a war. We are at war with Iran, but Israel has the upper hand. Israel has the initiative. How so? Because, as you said, we have taken out the senior brass of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps. We've taken out the Air Force of the Iranians. Not only that, but we've also eliminated key nuclear scientists involved in the nuclear weapons program. So we've removed much of the know-how, that's at play. Now, one of the things that will be very, very surprising to the Iranians and to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps is just how much penetration Israel's intelligence community and capabilities have shown themselves to have. And one of the reasons that we have that degree of penetration is that this regime and the armed forces, the terror organization that promotes its jihadist ideology domestically and overseas, is hated by much and many of the Iranian community. And therefore, there is a high degree of cooperation with counter Iranian regime operatives and assets, such as those that Israel has inside Iran. And that, in no small part, is one of the reasons that all of those who are at play there at the top of the IRGC have found themselves to be very, very, very exposed to Israel's capabilities. There really is a tri-pronged approach to what has happened here. Yaakov, I'd like you to talk a little bit more about that, but a couple of things that I want people to be aware of, which are really tremendous. The Mossad actually established a drone base inside Iran. That drone base was very, very close indeed to Tehran. And those drones struck the surface to surface missile launchers that were positioned and ready to target the state of Israel. There were also weapons systems that were smuggled into Iran and used to destroy Iran's air defense systems, giving greater freedom of movement to Israeli planes. And the Mossad, and there's actually been some footage that's been released showing this, the Mossad actually embedded its commandos inside central Iran with a view to deploying precision missiles to target anti-aircraft sites inside the Islamic Republic, and strikes were carried out against launch sites of Iranian drones and Iranian ballistic missile launching sites. So this is really an incredible, incredible operation. It's comprised of many pillars, and part of what's caused this ingenious method through which Israel has set about bringing this operation to fruition has been, quite frankly, the need for Israel, in no small part, to go it alone, and the realization by Israel that it might have to go it alone, and therefore using any number of assets that very few people would have considered that it would resort to. What's very much of interest to me, Yaakov, is that the Prime Minister has said this war, this operation, is going to continue for as long as is required. So this isn't just a one and done. We're going to see wave, and we're actually in the midst of waves at this time, wave after wave of strikes by Israel, leadingly by the Israeli Air Force, until such time as we're satisfied that Iran's nuclear weapons program has been rolled back to the degree that we want to see it rolled back. One of the questions that's hanging out there in the ether is whether or not the Americans will join with Israel and really take the fight to Iran. What do you say about that?
So I think the answer to that, based on the current American posture, is that it very much depends on what Iran does. In other words, the U.S. has signaled that it wants to stay out of this fight, which I think is disappointing. To be honest, I think that that's a disappointing posture, but okay, that's the decision that they've made. But that would quickly change if and when the Iranians target any American assets, embassies, bases in the Middle East. Now, the Iranians have already said that they consider the U.S. to be partly responsible for this attack, and they know that President Trump has confirmed that he was in on this attack. In other words, he was told about it ahead of time, and he absolutely was part of the deception that was involved in recent days that was designed to make the Iranians think that there's no attack on the immediate horizon. And that deception was a core part of the surprise that enabled the elimination of all of these key personnel. So the Iranians are not necessarily wrong in saying that the U.S. has a hand to play, although it's a very minor role on the whole. This is a blue and white operation from start to finish. Obviously, the U.S. has, U.S. weapons and U.S. systems and logistics and air defenses are all essential assistance, but this is an Israeli initiative from the beginning to the end. So the big question is, are the Iranians going to attack any American targets? If they do, I think that will very quickly bring in the Americans to this war. And if they don't, then I think the Americans will be happy to stay out of it and to enable Israel to continue its strikes. One last thing that I will add, you mentioned that there will be more strikes. I completely agree. I think what we have seen, though, today is an attempt by Israel to offer the Iranians an equation. And according to this equation, the equation basically says, look, if you taper off your response, if you respond and then start winding down your responses, we, Israel, will not go after your economic targets, the ports, the energy sites, all of those sites that would actually bring the Iranian economy to its knees and create an existential threat to the Iranian regime. If, however, Iran bombs, sends missiles to Israeli population centers, as they did tonight, as they did tonight, then the implicit Israeli threat here is that the future waves will not just be limited to pure military sites, but also going after, you know, dozens of Iranian energy sites, ports, just the kind of fuel ports that that Israel, sorry, has already bombed in Yemen, and that could destabilize the entire regime. That's even a bigger threat to the stability of the Iranian regime than striking military targets. Now, Defense Minister Israel Katz, responding to the Iranian ballistic missile attack tonight, said that Iran crossed the red line and it's going to pay dearly for that. And that to me suggests that Israel is saying, because even in war, adversaries talk, they signal to each other. And I think Israel is telling Iran, look, you had a chance to go after military targets. You didn't do that. You went after civilian targets. You hit our population centers in central Israel. Now you're going to pay. And so I think we're going to see more escalation. And the Iranians have not taken that into consideration, the equation that Israel appears to have offered them, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, a few things about that. So, just at the time of this recording, by my estimation, by my accounting, there have been a total of three staggered salvos toward Israeli sovereign territory that have not targeted military installations. One could make the argument, perhaps, that by way of some of these attacks by the Iranians toward Israel, they were actually targeting the Kiryat, which is the IDF headquarters in
Yeah,
Tel Aviv, basically in to put it in American terms, roughly in a geographical location equivalent to that of Times Square in Manhattan. Incidentally, a totally different subject, but I've no idea what earthly reason there could be put forward for why the Kiryat has to be in the middle of Tel Aviv. That's a different conversation. I believe there are
yeah,
250 to 300 projectiles that have been fired from Iran of various types and sizes, shapes, and lethality. 100 came in during one particular volley, one particular salvo. There were 5 to 7, maybe 8 specific areas in central Israel that were hit by way of those successive volleys. And the total number of individuals who have been reported to be injured rests at the figure of 8 last I looked. That may have gone up slightly since then, but it's a very, very low figure. And it's important for the listeners to realize that that is a consequence not of the intention of the Iranians, of course, but the brilliance of the Israeli Air Force and air defense capabilities, but also the investment by Israel in the very thing that Israel's enemies deny their own people, their own civilians, such as Hamas and the Gazan people, namely passive defense. Israelis everywhere, have been told to remain close, starting from the middle of the night yesterday, remain close to the bomb shelters that are either there for communal use or to the sheltered rooms that many, many Israelis have within their homes, such as the one that I have here in Rishon LeZion. And it's that sensible, normative aspect of the Israeli government's conduct that is so amiss in the conduct of Israel's enemies, as I mentioned, such as Hamas with regard to the Gazans, that keeps so many Israelis safe, so many Israelis alive, so many Israelis literally sheltered. And that's the reason that despite Iran's best efforts, the number of harmed and injured rests at less than 10, despite well over 200, perhaps close to 300 projectiles being fired toward us. Now, in addition to that, we of course have the vaunted air defense systems of the Israeli Air Force. But what's different this time is that you haven't seen the unfurling of that air defense array that involved the United States, Great Britain, Jordan, the UAE, and of course Israel during the two prior attacks from Iran towards sovereign Israeli territory. Now, the United States is said to be reconstituting that coalition. Jordan has been involved to some degree. It's certainly shot down some of the drones that were fired from Iran initially to overwhelm Israel's air defense capabilities, certainly to reduce those capabilities, to puncture those capabilities. But you have not seen that coalition that was there last time. And so it just bears mentioning that the Israeli Defense Forces is as engaged in defense as it is in offense. And I know from interviews that I've conducted with several individuals, primary among those, the former commander of the Israeli Air Force, Major General Eli Shkedi, Yaakov, who, as you know, oversaw Israel's raid on the Syrian nuclear reactor in 2007 in his capacity as commander of the Israeli Air Force, that as much time as the Israeli defense establishment spends on readying its offensive capabilities, it also primes itself for the defensive measures it needs to undertake in the likely event, certainly possible event, of a retaliatory strike. And we're seeing that playing out
Yeah,
almost to the exclusion of every other player in this arena.
for sure. And another thing that I think is worth mentioning is these missile attacks. By the way, according to the IDF, I just checked its message from about an hour ago before we started recording. They talked about two volleys consisting of about 100 missiles. There may be another volley since then that was directed at the north, perhaps. So that would tally up with the numbers that you were suggesting. But in any case, the missiles that we are now facing, one of the things that the defense officials have been saying throughout the day, really since 3 a.m., since this preemptive strike began, is that Israel reached the realization that the conventional Iranian ballistic missile program, even if you separate it completely from the nuclear threat, it in and of itself is an existential threat. And the reason for that is because the Iranians had taken the decision, Prime Minister Netanyahu added some details about this today, to start producing 300 of these missiles every month and to
Yes.
reach the stage where they have 10,000, 15,000, one day 20,000. Now, if we imagine 20,000 missiles, right, and each one of them, the warhead of a a ton and a half, these are missiles that can bring down multi-story buildings. Um, 20,000 missiles like that's an existential threat. You don't need a nuclear program. Now, if you add a nuclear program to that and Iran's proxy program, you are dealing with a situation which, according to the consensus view in the Israeli defense establishment and the government, our life here would become untenable. That we wouldn't be able to survive under those kinds of threats. And so this was a preemptive war to eliminate a host of existential forming threats, to eliminate tumors, if you will, that were well on the way to threatening the very existence, the lifeblood of this country. This is what's at stake. It really was um, an all or nothing moment. It was a now or never moment. There was no more room for nuance. There was no more room for, things that you've talked about, such as paralysis through overanalysis. The intelligence directorate delivered two very clear warnings to the government and to the rest of the defense establishment. They said, one, the conventional missile program is an existential threat, even if you look at it separately from the nuclear. And two, the Iranians have decided to go nuclear, and they're just pretending to hold these negotiations. So the Israeli intelligence directorate really did its job this time and provided the early alerts in time. And I think that a lot of that is lesson learning, from the 7th of October, of looking at what the enemy's up to, putting together the puzzle pieces, assuming the real intentions of our enemies. So this was a really, really good intelligence alert. And the capabilities that have been put in place, really, Benjamin, to my mind, somebody who lives and breathes, military affairs, I've never seen anything like it. I have never seen an Air Force able to execute such precise strikes at such long ranges against targets that are moving. Some of these targets are moving. I'm not talking about fixed targets, which in and of itself is a huge challenge if they're, hard targets, hardened targets. But many of these targets were moving personnel in their own country, 2,000 kilometers away. And yet they were taken out in their apartment buildings and their bunkers. So I think this is, going to take time for everybody to digest the magnitude of what has happened. And I think that whatever happens from here on end, Israel has demonstrated its superiority in terms of its offensive capabilities. Defensively, also, it is definitely many, many steps ahead, as you've noted. And I think Israel is going to win this war, Benjamin. I think the Iranians will be looking to end this war at some point because they are worried this could lead to the collapse of their regime. So I think that after they show the population that they've hit us and they fired their missiles, they're going to try and look for an off ramp at some point because they are extremely vulnerable at this stage going forward.
Yeah, and I think that it would be a missed opportunity were Israel and the United States not to press for the toppling of the regime in Iran at this
Hmm.
stage. They're clearly enfeebled. As I said at the top of this program, they're very much exposed militarily. As I also mentioned during my comments here a little bit earlier, part of the reason that the upper echelons of the Iranian terror military was so exposed was that they are absolutely reviled by so
Yep.
many Iranian people, so many civilians, so many members of Iran's community. And so they may just be there for the taking. And if they are there for the taking, I think we should go ahead and take it. A couple of other points, Yaakov, that I want to mention quickly, and then we can perhaps wrap, because the goal here is to give just really a bite-sized update to the listeners.
Hmm.
Interesting that Tom El-Baal, who is the commander of the Israeli Air Force, is one of not too many commanders who were in situ during the October 7th massacre. He has remained in situ. People will know, of course, that the former head of the IDF intelligence is somebody who resigned, Aaron Khaliva. They will know that Ronen Bar, the head of the Shin Bet, has resigned. They will know that Herzi Halevi, the Israeli Defense Forces chief commander during October 7th, he resigned. Finkelman, the head of the Southern Command, he resigned. But Tom El-Baal remains in situ, and it may well be that he remains in situ precisely for a time such as this. So that is an individual who has overseen an incredible campaign, and also the new head of the IDF intelligence, a very controversial promotion, incidentally, because he himself was involved in the disaster of the October 7th massacre. He, of course, has played his role in the planning for this raid as well. So credit
By the way,
must be
that's
given.
exactly why I wanted some of the people involved in the disaster to stay in their position. Not all, not even most, but I did want a few. I did want remnants because I think the trauma that was seared into their consciousness, some of them, it would cause them to make the repair, to make the fix. So I did want to see that, and I think Shlomi Binder, the head of the intelligence directorate, did manage to do that. We also have, by the way, Oded Basyuk, who's the head of the operations branch. He's also one of the remnants from the October 7th generation, even though he's scheduled to leave his post quite soon. So that's just an interesting side point that you made me remember when you described the events.
Yeah, and I remember you having that conversation with me, and I remember very clearly that that was your position, as you said, for some of them, not by any means for the majority,
Right.
but a select few. Now, it's also important for me to go back in time and talk about the fact that there was a lot of skepticism, including from me, about whether or not Israel actually had the political will to do that which was needed in order to rob Iran of its nuclear weapons program, at the very least, roll it back to a significant degree. And the reason for that was that we were deeply, deeply, deeply put off by and deterred by what I would describe as Iran's attack dog, namely Hezbollah inside southern Lebanon. The whole idea, to remind everybody, or one of the central ideas for the very existence of Hezbollah, was that they would be there right on Israel's border inside southern Lebanon. And in the event that Israel ever dared to strike at Iran, Hezbollah would unleash a wave of
Yep,
terror against
that's right.
Israel to the tune of many estimates 2,000, even 2,200 rockets fired upon our homeland per day,
Right,
not per operation, not per round,
right.
per day.
Hmm.
And what I want everybody to understand is that that threat has now been downgraded massively. I wouldn't say it's been eliminated completely, but it's been downgraded massively. So Israel doesn't have that consideration at the forefront of its calculus. We've also seen the fact that Hezbollah was removed from Syria. A lot of people don't talk about it, but Hezbollah absolutely had a foothold inside Syria, along with the Iranians. Both of those left when the Assad regime collapsed, something that Israel very much had a hand in bringing about. And the removal of Hezbollah and the collapse of the Assad regime and the removal of Russian air defense systems inside Syria actually gave the Israeli Air Force the ability to do that which would have been much more challenging, namely to fly the relevant sorties over Iran's territory and to target directly, independent of any assistance from anyone else, including the Americans, the strongholds that we've targeted over the past 24 hours approximately. So, what I just want people to recognize is there has been a series of massive miscalculations by Israel's enemies along the way. First, you
Yep.
had Hamas, who massively miscalculated how Israel would respond to the atrocity of October 7th. Hamas definitely will have thought that after a couple of weeks, world opinion would have brought Israel to a point where it would hang its fire and stop the campaign against the terror organization inside Hamas. Hamas was wrong about that, and the testimony to just how wrong they were lies in the graves of the terror leaders of that particular organization, along with their remains. You also had Nasrallah, who thought that he could have this sort of ping pong with Israel and that Israel would not target him. He was wrong. And all the way along, you had the Iranians thinking that something, somewhere along the line, would compel Israel to stop, and something, somewhere along the lines, would deter the state of Israel from doing that which it has learned it needs to do when its enemies overtly express their desire to bring about Israel's destruction. So it's really a very interesting series of miscalculations by
Yep.
Hezbollah, by Hamas, by Iran, and a very clear shift in the strategic viewpoint and perspective of the state of Israel. Israel is quite simply, and I don't mean this in a derogatory sense, it is a completely different animal today, militarily and in terms of its defense posture and strategy and doctrine, to whatever it was prior to October 7th.
I couldn't agree with you more, Benjamin. I think that that's a very accurate description, and that's why I sleep so much better at night. Even if there are sirens that will wake me up, I sleep much better at night because I know that Israel is proactive. Israel is taking the initiative on every front, every arena. And by the way, you mentioned something very interesting. You know, the collapse of the Assad regime and how Hezbollah was also positioned in Syria, which is very true. But in addition to that, you know, the collapse of the Assad regime, which let's remind the viewers, came about directly as a result of the defeat of Hezbollah by the victory, the Israeli victory over Hezbollah, which eliminated the ground force that would have fought for the Assad regime. And that gave the signal to the rebels in Syria to bring down the Assad regime. That event basically broke the Shiite axis. It broke Iran's ability to smuggle massive quantities of weapons through Syria into Lebanon. So it wasn't only about Hezbollah's presence, it was also just the whole of Syria being a massive smuggling opportunity or channel or whatever word you want to use. And once that came down, you know, and until this current strike, until this current war with Iran, many had viewed that collapse as actually the most significant event in the Middle East because of how badly it affected the wider Iranian Shiite axis. So really what we're seeing is from the 7th of October until now, Israel systematically taking out Iran's proxies that it had set up on our border in order to cause us to bleed to death and to collapse without Iran having to fight. And the exact opposite has happened. Its tentacles have been severed and dismembered and destroyed. And now we are going after the head of the octopus. And this is the order that things have gone in. And this is absolutely represents a massive defeat, I think, for the Iranian strategy to destroy Israel. And this strategy, the last thing I'll say, again, something that defense officials have been saying all day today, which I find fascinating, was not just a strategy. There was a concrete plan. It had a name. It was not very creative. It was called the Destruction of Israel Plan. This was a plan that sat on computer servers and in drawers in
You're sure
Iran.
it's not a creative name, Yaakov? You're sure you
It's,
don't?
I mean, these people obviously are not very, they didn't try to hide it very much. But
Right.
that's what it was. The Destruction of Israel Plan was a practical, concrete, step-by-step plan which was absolutely designed to be implemented, that the Iranians were planning to implement through their missiles, through the nuclear program, through the proxies. They were going to go and they were going to work to recover all their proxies and then move forward again and try and destroy us with this ring of fire. So, this is where we're at. They're on the defending side, they're on the losing side, they're on the side that's under attack. Israel has gone back, as you've said, to the old days where it takes the initiative against the enemies. And as long as that's the case, we will be on the winning side of history in this region. And there will be a ray of light in this region, not only for Israel, but for all of the non-jihadist people, countries, the Arab world that is moderate, that does want to live side by side with the state of Israel, places like the UAE and the Abraham, Accord countries and the Saudis. This is a big ray of light for all of the sane forces in this region and the forces of fundamentalism and darkness and medieval, barbaric ideology. Those forces have not, I don't think, ever been weaker than they are today.
Yeah, and just to go back to something else, Yaakov, and then we can each perhaps make a final comment, if you like.
Hmm.
This idea that here I do want to raise a note of caution, if I may, perhaps even a note of criticism, if I may. The idea that Israel is trying to come to some sort of balancing of some sort of equation, as you mentioned, around the notion that if Iran stops now,
Hmm.
stops firing at civilian targets within the Israeli homeland, that Israel will stay its hand and will not fire
Yeah, I
at
wanted to get your
civilian
opinion
targets.
on that.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think it's a mistake. I think it's a
Okay.
mistake. I think that that's just a little bit of residue of the
Mm.
pre-October 7th military idea and non-doctrine. We saw this with Hamas, where they would fire at civilian infrastructure.
Right.
And then what we would do is we'd go and, bomb some Hamas meeting point somewhere, right? To
Right.
no great effect ever, in my opinion, whatsoever, hence the atrocity that took place in part on October the 7th. I think that this idea that after Iran has not once, not twice, not thrice, but on four separate occasions really launched directly from its sovereign territory to our
Yep.
sovereign territory, and yet we persist in trying to bring about the balancing of this macabre equation that says, well, if you really stop now, if you just stop now, we won't actually retaliate in kind. I think that has to go. I really
Hmm.
think that the civilian front, not civilians, but the civilian front, must be
Hmm.
targeted
Hmm.
inside Iran by Israel. Because let me be very, very clear, flights have stopped here. We only have one
Yep.
airport.
Yep.
Flights can't come in and they can't go out. Israeli commerce has stopped here. People who aren't from Israel might look out over the streets of Israel at this time and say, what an incredibly calm, quiet place the state of Israel
Yep.
is. Nothing could be further from the truth at the best of times. But actually, what it is, it's a very tense place, and people are taking up refuge in their homes because they don't know what's coming at them from this rapacious, murderous, genocidal regime. So I really think that it should only take one hit on
Hmm.
civilian infrastructure in Israel, one set of damages on civilian infrastructure in Israel, for there to be a retaliation in kind. So if I could just give that note of caution, I don't
Sure.
think that we can have a reach back to what we had pre-October 7th. And I think my description of it is correct. Whether you agree with my conclusion or not, it is a residue from the pre-October 7th defense establishment posture here in
Hmm.
Israel. But we'll stop if you stop. No, I think if you go
Hmm.
for us, it needs to be we will go for you, and it will hurt you, and we will deliberately hit you where it hurts.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
I'd like to see that change come about. So you don't necessarily have to address yourself to that. I'd love to get your last word, and then I'll put my last word in after you, if I may.
Yeah, so I think you have a very clear perspective, and I don't think that I want to add much to that. What I will add is you mentioned the streets here, and here's the catch. You're absolutely right. People are tense, but there is a that extra degree of Israeli resilience that you'll only get here. But I guarantee you that if you still walk around in certain areas here in Jaffa and other areas, you will see cafes open, you will see people sitting around and having, wherever they can, their cup of coffee and a chat. Not necessarily something the IDF Home Front Command would approve of. And it declared a special
Right,
situation in
right.
gatherings. Or I'm not talking about large gatherings, but people haven't given up, even under this situation, have not given up the idea of going downstairs from their building to the street and having a cup of coffee with a friend. I think that that speaks to a level of resilience that is actually part of our secret. It's part of our secret formula for winning. It's this love of life that's uncompromising and not willing to be cowed even by 100 ballistic or more missiles fired from that evil regime that's called the Islamic Republic of Iran. Of course, I'm not talking about the Iranian people, and we talked about this in the last podcast. But the Israeli spirit, Benjamin, there's nothing like it.
Yeah, I would just say, Yaakov, that I think that that spirit is informed in no small part by the fact that Israelis understand. When we're forced to hunker down and when we're forced to stay close to our shelters in order to get rid of Iran's nuclear weapons program, we understand. We
Yep.
understand that that short-term pain is certainly worth the long-term gain that is going to come about by really divesting from this terror threat that has really endured for decades. It's endured for decades. It was there when I first made Aliyah back in, I think,
Yes.
2003, all right? It's high time that this was dealt with. Israelis understand that. And it's that understanding that gives, in no small part, that degree of resilience, that unique degree of resilience that you're describing there. It's also interesting, Yaakov, that this war has two war aims so far. It's been the return of
Mm,
all of the hostages, and we can't forget those hostages. May this result in the bringing back of the hostages somehow, some way. Perhaps the dots from what is taking place in Iran can draw a line back to the hostages being redeemed and released from inside the Gaza Strip. The second war aim was for the total end of Hamas's capability to constitute a threat toward the state of Israel ever again from inside the Gaza Strip. At no point was a war aim expressed that we were to end Iran's nuclear weapons capability. But yet here we are. And that goes to show that some of the most virtuous pursuits need not be articulated, they need merely to be implemented, as we're seeing occur right now on our watch. And I must tell you, Yaakov, I'm incredibly proud today to be an Israeli. I'm incredibly proud to be in Israel. And I think that Jews looking on from overseas will be incredibly proud of the state of Israel themselves. And it's a dreadful, dreadful situation. But those same Jews in the United States, in Britain, in Germany, in France, in Australia, wherever they may be, because they're proud of the state of Israel and its determination to survive and to fight and to thrive and to curb the evil desires of its enemies, because they're proud of that, the nations around them, or the nations, many among the nations by which and within which they're hosted, will say, you have dual loyalty. You have dual
hmm
loyalty. You support the state of Israel, even though our government does not support what the state of Israel is doing at this time with regard to Iran or with regard to Gaza. I would just say to those Jewish people overseas, stay proud. there's no harm in that degree of dual loyalty. It makes all the sense in the world that you would at once be a proud, loyal American, and as a Jew, a proud supporter of the state of Israel as it defends itself against existential threats. Remember, friends, that if a Chinese American, Asian American is able to celebrate his or her American heritage alongside their Asian heritage, if a Somali American is able to celebrate their Somalian heritage alongside their American heritage, if a French American is able to celebrate their French heritage alongside their American heritage, then absolutely yes, a Jewish American can celebrate their Jewish heritage alongside their American heritage, and a central pillar of that Jewish heritage, despite the world wanting to remove and destroy that pillar, is the existence of the state of Israel. And that doesn't come about without standing your ground when enemies around you say, we're going to wipe you off the face of the earth. So the next time people accuse you of dual loyalty, perhaps you should celebrate the fact that you're able at once to be a loyal and proud American, a loyal and proud Jew. And the wonder of all of that is that so often the tenets of that loyalty are utterly reconcilable one with the other, your Jewishness and your Americanness. It's a beautiful, beautiful reality. It's something that you ought to celebrate. And I just say that I thank God for the pilots of the State of Israel. I thank God for the intelligence forces of the State of Israel. I thank God for the commandos who are on the ground that we saw some grainy footage of somewhere in Iran. You know, I just came back from the death camps in Poland, Yaakov. Uh, if we had had the State of Israel then, what took place at that time would not have happened.
Correct.
But I dare
Yeah.
say, if we had said to some of the people who found themselves in the midst of the horrors of the Holocaust that one day there would be Israelis who would go to the ends of the earth in order to defend the one and only Jewish state, some of them may have believed it, but a great many more of them would have disputed that such a reality would ever come about. And you and I have the privilege of living in that reality. We're right where we want to be. And the final thing that I will say, Yaakov, and I do address the listeners here specifically, this is not the type of dynamic where we will not pay a certain price. We will pay a certain price. We're already paying that price. As I said at the top of the program, Israelis are living in their shelters. But stay very, very clear-eyed, everybody. The price that we are paying is trivial. Yes, I say it, trivial, compared to the price that we would pay were Iran to gain those nuclear weapons capabilities, were Iran to bring about that ballistic missile manufacturing capabilities. The Prime Minister's right, the defense establishment's right, and all of you who stand by the state of Israel are on the side of right. And may we go from strength to strength. And Yaakov, I don't really have anything else to say except that I pray for Shalom al Israel, which may be arrived at by the complete destruction of Iran's nuclear weapons program.
I have very little to add as well. I'm just getting some siren alerts as well, and I take that with an inner calm because, as you've said, I think that this is a price that is absolutely necessary and worth paying for the greater good, which is our future and our children's future and the future of the Jewish homeland. So I feel very confident that we are going to win this war, Benjamin. I really have 100% full confidence in our ability to achieve this victory. I think we're stronger than our enemies, and the righteous path is ours and not theirs. So I think everything is going to be okay as a collective for us here. And on that note, perhaps we'll call it a night, and I'll see how I can get home.
Yeah, get home safely, Yaakov.
Will
All the
do.
very best. Over and out from us.
Thank you. Bye bye.